Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language, currently teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and as of fall 2017 at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm back today to discuss another topic in Norse language and myth, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the vocabulary of color in Old Norse. This is both something that I've been asked about a fair amount by Patreon supporters, and also a topic that I have a special interest in, as my own PhD dissertation concerned the categorization of color in Old Norse. I've also published several articles on the subject. Different languages categorize color differently, even though most humans perceive the same differences between colors. So for instance, an English speaker will look at something that's dark blue, something that's light blue, and something that's green. And even though the space between these colors on a color wheel might be the same, the dark blue and the light blue will both be considered types of blue, whereas the green will be considered a different type of color altogether. But you can imagine a language in which the dark blue and the light blue are also different types, and they're not both types of one bigger type, blue. This is the case in Russian, where there is a light blue basic color and a dark blue basic color. And so this is what I mean by languages categorizing differently, even though they might have the same perceptions. Old Norse has relatively few high-level basic categories compared to English. The basic color terms, according to me, are svartur, which means black. Note that I'm using Old Norse pronunciation here. I'll put a card up in the top right with some videos about Old Norse and modern Icelandic pronunciation for more information about that. Svartur, black. Hvítur, white. Rauður, red. Blár, blue. Bleikr, yellow and pink. I'll get back to this. Grár, gray. And grön, green. You'll often see that spelled with an OE together, or in modern Icelandic spelling an AE together. These basic terms are the ones that are most used in Old Norse, and are the ones that contrast with each other the most. In literature, the colors that are contrasted most tend to be the most basic, and they tend to have the most symbolic value, all of which speaks to high psychological salience or importance in the language. There are some differences from how we use color in English today. One of the most notable things is that the color term that occurs the most in the Old Norse corpus is rauður. About 1/3 of all descriptions of things in terms of color in Old Norse are red. This includes a lot of blood. This is a fairly violent literature, but it also includes gold. Gold in Old Norse is considered red, and this is also something you see in other old Germanic and Slavic languages. Why exactly gold should be considered red is a little bit unobvious to us today. It does not seem that the gold used at that time had any especially high copper content, which would have made it more reddish. It's possible that this is a case of type modification. Type modification is when you use a more basic color term in order to classify different things rather than to describe them. So think about in English red and white wine, which are rarely blood red and snow white. They usually, if we were just being objective, we'd probably call them something like purple and light yellow, maybe, but definitely not basic red and white. But we use the basic colors to classify red wine versus white wine rather than to describe their color. And so it's possible that precious metals had a similar type modification system in Old Norse and other Old Germanic languages. For instance, silver is always described as white and gold as red, and then this is just a way of classifying your precious metals rather than of describing their colors in terms of a more naturalistic system. It's notable that the word that is closer to yellow in Old Norse, bleikr, when used of gold, implies low quality gold, which I think also supports this type modification idea. It's also quite likely that the yellow category is very new in Old Norse, and that there is some residual use of red for yellow things. For instance, the sun is also red in Old Norse, as is the yolk of an egg, although depending on your breed of chicken, you can have red yolks today too. Blár for blue is another case of wide disagreement. A lot of times you'll see blor translated as black in text translated from Old Norse. For instance, in the Complete Sagas of Icelanders volume that is often cited, blor is always translated as black with no comment. It's never translated any differently from Svartir. Same thing with the Skaldic Poetry Project online. A lot of this is based on the fact that blor is used for ravens, but if you are a raven lover, as I would count myself, and you look at ravens closely, you'll notice that they shine blue. They have a blue tint to their feathers that shows up especially under particular angles of sunlight. This is a property that their feathers share with things like coal and obsidian, and coal is also described as blue sometimes in Old Norse. But ravens are not described just as blue, they are also described as svartir sometimes, and all the occurrences of ravens described as blue are in poetry, where it is not surprising that someone would use a sort of pretty observation about the color of the bird to produce a striking effect, the blue raven. In fact, Western area writer Edward Abbey often remarked on ravens as blue or blue-black in his more rhapsodic passages about the beauty of the American West. The other reference described by blor also tend to be more obviously blue, things like smoke and bruises and clothing. Blor is used for clothing more often than any other color in Old Norse, and it's also notable that in medieval Scandinavia, blue clothing is overwhelmingly the color of clothing that is found. Bleikr, in modern Icelandic, this has come to mean pink, but in the color of horses, it means bay, so a yellowish color. Looking at it in Old Norse, I find both uses outside of just horses, so you also see this yellowish meaning outside of horses. What I think Bleikr is in Old Norse is any color that is warm, right? So on the orange, yellow, light brown side of things, but not red. So it's like non-optimal warm colors. If red is the warm color par excellence, Bleikr is anything that's not red, but it's clearly still a warm color. It can't be classified as blue or green. Gror means gray. There's also some subtypes of gray that I'll talk about in a moment. And grun means green, basically the same as English or a modern Scandinavian language. There are also some additional words that I don't think are basic color types in Old Norse, but are used mostly for specialized vocabulary. For instance, brun, which has come to mean the general color brown in the modern Scandinavian languages, in Old Norse seems to be used basically just for horses. When it's used for other things, it always seems to be evoking the horse color. So I think this is somewhat analogous to the use of the color chestnut in English today. You can use it for something other than a horse, but if you use it for something other than a horse, you're thinking of the horse color. Similarly, jarpur seems to be used only for human brown hair. This may surprise you if you speak modern Icelandic, because in modern Icelandic, jarpur means a horse's brown hair. So this has become just a horse color, whereas this has become a more general color. Color terms and their uses do change over time. Similarly with gulur, which in the modern Scandinavian languages, including Icelandic, has come to be the basic word for yellow. In Old Norse, this seems to be just a human hair color, probably blonde. And then we have two specialized words, hos and hor, that are used mostly for the gray or white colored hair of old people. On the subject of human color, I should mention that human beings are sometimes described as hvítur or white, but this does not mean Caucasian. For one thing, in the Old Norse context, there's very little reason to specify that someone is Caucasian. But for another thing, it's associated with two very different cultural judgments. We have to remember that in pre-modern societies, a person's tan or lack of tan was often a status symbol. So for instance, a person with very tan skin shows that they work outside quite a bit. A person with very pale skin is kept inside and therefore is probably of higher status. Women who are described as white are being described as high status because they can stay inside, and this is considered very beautiful. Men who are described as white, it can go one way or another. Gods described as Hvítir, like Balder and Heimdallr, are probably being said to be very beautiful because they shine, they reflect like white snow. But a normal man described as Hvítir is often being called a coward. So this may imply that he stays inside, or it could just be referring to like the pallor of skin or something like that. The more desirable color for a man to be described as is rjóður, which is derived from ráður. Rjóður could be translated as like English ruddy. It implies a kind of reddish complexion generated from being out in the sun. Curiously, blor is used for the color of the skin of people from sub-Saharan Africa, who are described as blåmenn, literally blue men, in Old Norse. This has caused a lot of speculation too about why exactly this color of skin was interpreted as blue. I think that because a person could be described as svartur for having black hair. So for instance, I'm svartur in an Old Norse context because of my black hair. That calling someone a svartmaður would be confusing. It doesn't sound like anything from outside of Scandinavia. You know, it just sounds like a person with black hair. Similarly, these colors that are associated more with hair color would not really evoke the right image, I think, for an Old Norse speaker. So I think this is just the closest that they could get to a cool color that didn't imply a hair color, and also perhaps suggested something exotic. Blåmenn and the sagas are often these sort of fantastic warriors who are often in a king's retinue, and you know, there's a certain exoticness to their description, and I think the color term may have been part of that. Well, I hope this has been somewhat interesting and informative for you. And from the University of California, Berkeley, I'm wishing you all the best.